So let's start out by talking about these mental factors. And so, according to the Mahayana Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism is part of the form of Buddhism called Mahayana Buddhism, which is a Buddhism that is very much focused on feeling a love and compassion for all beings. Beautiful ideal of a bodhisattva, like a being who dedicates their whole life to that ideal. And according to this tradition, there's a cascade of 5 ever-present mental factors that accompanies every moment of consciousness. And I was really interested in the mind, as a college student and so on. And so I went, very early on into these topics. But when I first learned them, I actually didn't find them that relevant to transforming my mind. And it's possible, some of you have studied these topics too, because you can study it quite academically in this tradition. I wasn't quite sure why it was useful to learn these mental factors until I discovered how to use them in everyday life from a couple of sources. And I'm going to give you kind of the Cliff Notes shortcut to that. But just to quickly explain these 5 mental factors, and again, there's some experts here who know these very well. And they come in different orders sometimes in different teachings. But the idea is that first your senses make contact with some like visual, sonic, or tactile sensation. So, the way your mind or your brain engages through your senses with unfiltered reality, like whatever that might mean. Then next there's a mental factor called perception, and that's when your mind wraps these this bundle of raw data, as you might think of it, in today's language, and categorizes and names bundles of data as particular objects or experiences. Then your mind has what's called a feeling, and this is something quite precise in Buddhism, which is that some perception is either pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral. It's a very simple definition of feeling compared to ours of emotions. And then after that, you can see your mind moving to attention, that there's a huge amount of perception coming into your mind, and you can pay more attention to some and less to others. And a lot of that is automatic, of where your mind goes and where it flees from. So then finally, after perception, based on feeling and what you've perceived, whether that's a person or an object or an idea, you have an urge. I like this term urge, which is Alexander Beretson uses this term rather than, there's other terms, volition, and some other terms that are used, but I really like the term urge because it's understandable by everyday people, that you have an urge to do something about that feeling. So like many of the more intellectual teachings on the mind, I think it's reasonable for people to say, who cares? Contact, perception, feeling, attention, urge. It's just like, it's another thing to learn. Why do I need to know this list? And there is a reason. Obviously there's some reason they've been teaching this for at least 1,500 years, and maybe back to the Buddha. But the reason I've found is that this sequence helps you to understand how your feelings are biased by past conditioning, how your feelings are often exaggerated, and then how they lead to words and actions that you might later regret. So that kind of explains how our mind kind of goes off the rails sometimes. But more importantly, it also explains how you can stop thoughts in their tracks, ones that you don't want to be pulled along by. And so I'll explain that by going through these in a little bit more detail. One of the first ways to start analyzing the mental factors is to look at the first 2 mental factors of contact and perception, and notice how most, if not all, of what we perceive is psychological. So the idea that there's an objective reality becomes really problematic and questionable when you realize how everything you experience is genuinely in your mind. It's not saying there isn't anything out there that comes through your senses, but the only way you experience them is through your mind's interpretation, the mental model that you build up. The Buddhist model of the mind explains how none of us has direct access to physical reality itself, which is a scientific truth. It's not a subjective point of view. But instead, that what each of us apprehends are these processed sensory signals that appear to our minds. And from them, we construct a model of reality in our heads. And so I went and researched a lot about non-Buddhist points of view, other scientists who've explored this. And from the very early ages of the Western Enlightenment, there are many different thinkers like Galileo and Darwin who've all said very similar things, that like light is just the vibration of invisible electromagnetic energy at different frequencies. Like light isn't visible, right? It's only our minds that create this illusion of some small slice of the electromagnetic spectrum appearing as colors and forms and so on. When those vibrations beam through your eyes to stimulate your brain, you mentally construct the different colors that appear to it. There's no red, there's no orange, there's no yellow, there's no green, no blue that exists outside the mind. And it's the same with sound. They say sound is actually, for people that love music, especially, sound's just a variation in air pressure. But sound is silent. Sound actually doesn't make any noise. It's only your ears and your brain that transforms, little variations in air pressure into all the mental constructs of noises, words, and music. What you're hearing right now, right? It only exists in your mind. There aren't real words. There aren't real sounds. It's constructed by your mind. I had the pleasure of talking to this neuroscientist, Anil Seth, who wrote a great book called Being You, great book about consciousness. And he uses this great phrase. He describes the inner reality that we each fabricate as a controlled hallucination. And so I like this because he's one of the foremost researchers on consciousness. You weren't even allowed to study consciousness really in science 20 years ago, 25 years ago, like when I was in college. But now it's a field with legitimate researchers and grants and so on, good books. And what he says is that the brain synthesizes a virtual inner reality with these incoming sensory signals, what he calls a controlled hallucination. I really like that term for what our inner experience is. And then something else comes about when we realize that perception is psychological, which is that our imagination, our memory, our dreams can feel just as real as the reality that perception constructs from our five senses. And so that's why Buddhism describes a sixth sense. There's a sixth sense in Buddhism. And this sixth sense, it's not an ability to see ghosts or predict the future or anything like that. It's the mind's interior ability to produce images, sounds, and thoughts without sensory input. So in the Buddhist model of perception, our mind has the ability to differentiate objects from one another, like bundling the constant stream of sensory and imaginative stimulation into discrete packages that we label as objects or concepts. Like this is what we call perception. And it's a little disconcerting when you start to think about this, because when you realize that perception is just a mere collection of sensory signals, you start to realize that there really are no real objects out there in the world. This is actually a more advanced Buddhist teaching, but it falls right out of this, one of these first principles of the mind, that objects are just convenient labels that we place on collections of sensory stimulation, imagination, memory. So this collection of energy and particles is me, and that collection is Venerable Droma over there. That collection that's delicious chocolate, that's bitter medicine, that's the sweet voice of my partner over there. Hi. That's the annoying speech of the person I didn't vote for. All of these they're psychological constructs. None of them really exist intrinsically, right, on their own. So when we realize that perception lacks objective truth, here's where it becomes useful, finally, is that it offers us a way to question the strong feelings and the urges that we experience in relation to the objects that we perceive. I think it's the first way that understanding the mind according to this model helps chip away at the way we can be pulled along by our urges. And it gives us the opportunity to choose more beneficial ways to respond to them. So after contact perception, we look at this mental factor of feeling, and that's what we define as our immediate reaction of pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral to the objects that we perceive. whether they're real or imagined. You can have strong feelings about a dream or a fantasy or delusion. So pleasant feelings make us want to repeat whatever experience provoked them, and then unpleasant feelings make us want to avoid whatever brought them about. And then there's also this neutral feelings that evoke indifference. I really like Robert Thurman's term for this, which he says numbness, because it's not the most neutral. Is actually not really it's not really devoid of valence, because you are a little bit numb, I think, to experience when it's like something doesn't matter. You don't care. That's what I liked how Robert Thurman talked about it that way. So, like I was saying, the mental factor of feeling doesn't equate with emotions as we commonly understand them. And my understanding, from a lot of, I'm not Tibetan, obviously, but my understanding is that the Buddhist psychological system doesn't have an analog for the Western term emotion. I've heard this teaching many times, even though I don't know Tibetan or Sanskrit. But from the Buddhist perspective, emotions are combinations of the more primal mental factor of feeling combined with the thoughts that elaborate it. When you combine this pleasant, unpleasant, neutral with all of our other elaborations, you start to get the type of emotions that we think about in the West. So it could still be a little bit annoying to memorize these 5 mental factors, although I did find it quite useful myself eventually. But I do have a lazy shortcut to making practical use of them, which is to share the one place that it's said that you can stop this cascade from contact to urge. So they say it's almost automatic. Sometimes they even say they arise simultaneously, but I mean, when I've dug a little deeper with very experienced teachers, that generally this order that I described is kind of makes sense to us psychologically. So how do you stop that cascade from contact to immediately doing something about it? Is to pause that feeling. That feeling is the one place where you can start to control your mind according to this model. So if you can slow your mind down right as you're experiencing the pleasant, unpleasant, or neutral feelings, then you can consciously choose how to respond to those feelings instead of automatically following the urges that they provoke. So that was, I also got this out of a great book Ben Connolly wrote called Inside Vasubandhu's Yogacara, not the most accessibly named book, but there was some wonderful ideas in that, and that he really emphasized that this mental factor of feeling is where if you can slow yourself down, you can stop that cascade. So then to go on to the next one about urge, this next mental factor of urge is more commonly called intention or volition, which I find a little bit inaccessible words, although they're accurate. I like Alexander Bertson's translation for this term because this is the part of your mind that drives you to do things, or at least want to do things, in response to your feelings. So urges get you up off the couch. I remember one of my teachers saying that once. I actually often think about that in the morning. When you're in your bed in the morning, you're like, oh, I don't want to get out of bed. I don't want to. And then all of a sudden you get out of bed. That I always think, oh, that's urge. That's that mental factor that gets me out of bed. Is like, what is the thing that finally gets you out of bed? In Buddhism, it's this mental factor of urge. And in Buddhism, urge is also the dominant factor in the creation of karma. And so that's, for anyone unfamiliar with that term, that's the imprints of actions from prior lives that affect experiences in this life. There's a lot of ways of explaining it, but that's a simple way. But I'm always looking for ways to explain Buddhism without karma because there's not scientific evidence for karma, so it's something you have to kind of come to believe through different ways, and maybe over a long time if you weren't raised in a culture with it. And so I like to say you can understand urge in a more practical way without recourse to karma, because whatever the mechanism, both Buddhists and scientists agree that our current thoughts and actions strengthen or weaken our future mental habits. And science understands this as the principle of neuroplasticity. This is like the mechanism from which we see that when we do something, when we have a thought or an action, we create we slightly strengthen the neurological pathways for doing or having that thought in the future. So in Buddhism, there's different ways. For people who are really educated about this, this is a simplification. But in Buddhism, the mental factor of urge is elaborated into dozens of different states of mind that drive us to action, like a resolve, a wish, a grudge. But they're always things that move us toward a mental or a physical act, whether we follow through on it or not. And so once the urge has been activated, both in theory and through my own personal experience, it can be hard to stop the nearly automatic follow-through. I think we all have that experience. And I've also seen scientific studies of this, like that a lot of what human beings do are loops that we get triggered by something like the first few words of an argument you've often had with your wife, for example, just to pick a random example. Or, an addiction that you have, something, eating. I talked to Dan Harris recently, and he described eating a sleeve of Oreos. This is a very American kind of addiction, but Oreos come in these long cylindrical things that they call sleeves. So eating like 20 cookies at once. But once you've like even had that idea, it's very, all of a sudden, 20 minutes later, you don't feel so good. So when we slow down that preceding mental factor of feeling with meditation techniques, particularly this technique of mindfulness that allows you to see what's going on in your mind without responding, without having to act on it, then you can pause. And they say, and even my own experience is that you can pause urges even as strong as like addiction, violence, depression. I think you can find many people talking about how meditation and this type of meditation has helped them with those type of problems. In addition to the milder variations like eating a sleeve of Oreos or having a fight with your partner. So there's another aspect of the mind. That's a little, thanks for getting through those 5 mental factors with me. Hopefully that was slightly entertaining and useful. Really, when I first learned them, I didn't quite understand why it was important. But so there's a really interesting thing I wanted to talk about next, which is that when you probe your mind in meditation, when you start to use these techniques, you often pay attention not just to what's happening in your mind, but whether the mental factors that arise there are harmful or beneficial. And then whether you want to let go of certain thoughts or encourage other thoughts. Again, this is where it sort of like slightly varies from science, because you're not just observing, but you're really looking at how these things affect your mind and your happiness and the world. So in Buddhism, harmful states of mind are referred to as delusions. So these are mental states that disturb you, like rage, addiction are good examples. And then beneficial states of mind are the ones that make you feel satisfaction, self-respect, presence. And they can be gentle ones, like compassion and kindness. I'm a big fan of Venerable Drolma, who's a big fan of gentleness, and a good example of it. But also forceful ones. There's forceful positive states of mind, like effort and awe, are 2 that we learn about in Buddhism that can be very powerful and positive, but also very strong. So when you're meditating, it can feel like you're disturbing and beneficial thoughts are equal opponents, like fighting each other. Like, have you ever seen these cartoons where there's a little angel and a devil on someone's shoulders, and like the angel's telling you to do something good and the devil's telling you to do something bad? And that's that equal view. Like they're both equals, and it's our choice to choose between them. That's a little bit like the Christian view, I think, too. Sometimes it's like they're both fighting, and you have the choice. And then some people, I think, would even assert that negative thoughts have the upper hand. Venerable Drolma and I were talking about this on our walk today, the different views of reality. And the great writer named Cormac McCarthy just died yesterday. He definitely had that view. He had this real view that, violence, anger, oppression are like the dominant, the dominant forces in the human mind. And we ignore those. We ignore that, what he saw as, I think, as a fact about human existence at our peril. But one of the most powerful claims that Buddhism makes about our mind is that our inner angels and devils are not equal at all. And so despite how much you might have heard about how Buddhism's focus on suffering, Buddhism holds this optimistic view that the mind is fundamentally good. This was one of the most amazing things I discovered about Buddhism when I first started studying it. And it's said that beneficial states of mind are our deepest ones. Like that's our fundamental nature. And then disturbing states of mind, even though they sometimes overpower us, are superficial. And this is really interesting because it also says that we don't need to fight or demonize our delusions, that we just need to let them pass by without acting on them. And then if you cultivate the intrinsic states of goodness, the delusions will just naturally disappear. Like it's such a positive, constructive view of reality. And so this claim of humanity's fundamental goodness is what Buddhists call our Buddha nature. I don't think the Buddha called it that. The Buddha didn't call his teachings Buddhism either, right? All these things with Buddha came afterwards. So another term for it is the fundamental goodness of our mind, which I really like. Venerable Sangye Kadro uses that. There's scientific evidence for it. There's a scientist in Berkeley named Dr. Keltner has studied this a lot. Robert Sapolsky also. Both of them has written books about this. And they've probed this idea in their research, and they found scientific support for Buddha. I've been asking scientists a lot about this because I do find it encouraging, yet maybe hard to prove. And arguing with people who have the same view as Cormac McCarthy, like how can you defend this idea that humans are fundamentally good? So some evidence comes from studies that show that people's first instincts in a social situation are biased towards cooperation. They've tested people very carefully in laboratory, and for the great majority of people, they're biased towards cooperation as their first instinctual act. Something might stop them from cooperating, but if you test people's very, very first impulse, the majority of people have an impulse to help. You could give a whole talk or a whole weekend seminar on this. I'm just giving a couple sentences on it. But another form of evidence comes from analyzing our bad behavior and finding that most of it stems from problems that we exaggerate or imagine. This is Dr. Rick Hansen talks about this a lot. And if you actually get into a state of mind that's aligned with how things actually are, you can relax and be happy. So of course this research on human nature isn't definitive. I know there are even scientists who disagree with some of those results. And also, what I found is there are Buddhists that are skeptical about this seemingly idyllic belief in our fundamental good nature. Like there are different Buddhist traditions that take different views on this idea of Buddha nature. And so, especially Venerable Sangye Kadro, again, is so good about enumerating a lot of these different views. And so that's why, from what I've seen, is some schools of Buddhism limit their optimism to the more defensible claim that the mind is just changeable. That's another way of viewing the idea of Buddha nature that's a little bit more middle of the road, and that it can change for the better. Venerable Joel and I were talking about this also about Venerable Rene today. How he said once, what if life has no meaning except what you give it? Which is still a reason to do